Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation. My name is Rebecca Vallis, and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the National Academy of Social Insurance. We are so glad to have you all joining us today for what has become an annual tradition here at the Academy, and that's coming together on the week of the release of the annual Social Security Trustees Report to unpack what the report tells us and what it means for the future of Social Security. If you're here today, you know well that Social Security is one of the most successful and popular programs in our nation's history. For 90 years and running, it has helped Americans retire with dignity, provided critical protection when workers experience disability, and it's supported families after the loss of a loved one. For more than 90 years, it has been part of the fabric of American life, and nearly every American either already relies on it or expects to rely on it in the future. This week's trustees report and today's conversation about the trustees report comes at an especially consequential moment. With the reserve depletion date now projected to fall in 2032, and you'll hear more about that and lots of details around that, the report makes clear that the next president and the leaders elected in upcoming elections will likely be the ones called upon to address Social Security's long-term financing challenges. But before we get into all of that and what the various policy choices are, it's really important to start with the facts. And so to help us start there and to understand this year's trustees report, we are so incredibly fortunate to be joined by Karen Glenn, Chief Actuary of the Social Security Administration, who's here with us to walk us through the findings of the 2026 trustees report, and importantly, to help us understand what the numbers do and don't tell us about the state and the future of the program. After Karen's presentation, we'll be joined by an outstanding panel of experts who'll help us put that report in context. What does it mean for current and future beneficiaries, for workers, for families, for policymakers? And how do we put all of what we've heard today in context for the broader ongoing debate around retirement security and Social Security more broadly? Don't worry, we'll leave lots of time at the end for audience questions. So as questions pop into your mind throughout the conversation, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit them. We'll be monitoring questions throughout, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can at the end of the program. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce and hand it over to Karen Glenn, Chief Actuary of the Social Security Administration. Karen, thank you so much for being with us again.
You're welcome, Rebecca. It is a pleasure to be with you all today. We are going to go through a few slides today. I'm going to go through those relatively fast because I know we want to get to the panel discussion and then your questions. So if we could put those slides up on the screen and move on to slide 2. Great. All right. So number one, what is the legislative mandate for the Social Security Trustees Report? Why do we do this report? Why does it matter? What needs to be in it? We are mandated by law to talk about the trust fund operations of the past year and the next 5 years. And hang on just a minute. I'm going to see if I can make those slides a little bigger for myself. There we go. All right. So we talk about the trust fund operations of the past year and the next 5 years, the actuarial status of the trust funds. And what does that mean? That's the ability to meet the cost of the scheduled benefits with the scheduled revenue and the trust fund reserves, and the extent to which that scheduled revenue falls short under current law, which indicates the size of the legislative changes that will be needed. This report has been produced every year starting in 1941. I was not there at the time, but a long history of our office completing this report. Next slide, please. All right, there were 4 primary changes this year in the projections for the report. Number 1 was a change in the assumption for the ultimate total fertility rate. We lowered that from 1.90 children per woman to 1.75 children per woman. This lowering reflects continuing low birth rates in recent years in the US and around the world, and societal changes we've seen related to family formation and the desire for children. So we took that kind of incremental step this year to lower that assumption to 1.75. We also made some changes in our assumptions related to immigration, and these were mainly for the unlawfully present immigrant population. We lowered the levels of net immigration, um, reflecting recent historical data that we've seen, and also revised expectation for immigration and emigration from that unlawfully present population. Third change was about near-term economic assumptions. We are assuming real GDP per hour worked. For those of you economists, that's labor productivity and average real earnings. They're both assumed to grow faster in the near term than in last year's report. This again reflects what we've seen in recent data, improved near-term outlook for these economic factors, and what we expect to go on over the next few years. The fourth major change this year was a law change. This was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It was enacted on July 4th, 2025. The mechanism that this affects Social Security is about the income taxation of Social Security benefits. So because future income tax rates and standard deductions were changed, putting more money in seniors' pockets meant less money is going into the Social Security trust funds. So future revenues from those income taxes on benefits will be reduced in the future. Next slide. All right, zooming in a little bit on the birth rates that we changed. This graph shows you all the way back to 1900, what we saw in the historical data by year of birth of mother. So for women born in 1900, going all the way out to 2045. So those are clearly projections when we get to the end. The purple line is the historical data. How many children did a woman have over her lifetime at each of those birth years? You can very clearly see the baby boom in the purple. That's the big hump up in the middle. The declines to about 2 children per woman. And then in recent years, for completed cohorts, it's averaging just a little over 2 children per woman. Now, that said, uh, given the recent historical data, the blue in the middle is a mix of historical and projected data. So the further over to the left you are, the more historical data that is. The further over to the right on this graph, the more that's a pure projection. Way over to the right are the trustees' ultimate assumptions. So the one in the middle is that 1.75 we talked about. You can see that it is a gradual decline in that intermediate blue period, getting us down to that 1.75. And then recognizing the range of uncertainty for this assumption. The trustees have what we call a low cost assumption and a high cost assumption. The range of those is from 1.4 to 2.1, just understanding that this is a really uncertain assumption. We are predicting what women in the future will want in terms of births. That is definitely one of the more difficult assumptions we make. So, next slide, please. All right, we wanted to show in this graph what the changes we made to the fertility and immigration assumptions do to our population projections for the future. So the blue line at the very top is where we were in last year's trustees report. This is starting now, going all the way out to 2100. You can see by the time we got to 2100 in last year's report, we were at about 450 million Americans. The changes we made in this year's report brought that down significantly. If you just change the fertility rate, that gets us down to that green line, where we are at about 410 million at the end of the period. Also, with the changes in the immigration, that gets us down to a little under 400 million by the end of the period. Those of you with eagle eyes may see that there's also a purple line in there, which falls right under the red. That's just telling you that changes other than the ones to the fertility and immigration had very little effect. Almost everything we changed was due to those fertility and immigration changes. So as you can see, these changes compound over time. By the time we get out to 2100, there's a significant change in our population projections. Next slide. All right, we talked a little bit about changes we made in near-term economic assumptions, and this graph gets at that a little bit. This is showing us average weekly real US earnings over time. You can see some interesting patterns during the pandemic period, which have abated. But the thing to focus on here are the changes to the right of that solid line. These are the projections in this year's and last year's reports. The blue line is last year, the red line is this year. You can see that earnings per week are growing slightly faster in this year's report. This is consistent with the change in the assumption for labor productivity and just a small boost over the near term. Next slide. All right, almost a side note in this year's report is the disability insurance projections. The real focus this year is on the changes in the OASI program, but we did want to show you that applications for disabled worker benefits do remain near historically low levels. They're a little above where they were in the early 2020s, but well below the peak in about 2010, 2011. You can see that in this year's report, we are projecting a little bit of a more gradual path up to the ultimate level of application projections, which is at really more of a historical long-term level. Will we get back up to those levels, I think, is sort of an outstanding question, but this is what we are projecting at the moment. Next slide. All right, this is sort of the headline numbers of every trustees report. When are the trust fund reserves going to deplete? Number one, we look at the OASI and DI trust funds together, calling those OASDI. That is in the third quarter of 2034, same quarter as in last year's report. And that's really due to some offsetting factors, which we already talked about. The improved near-term economic outlook largely offsets the changes in immigration assumptions and the effects of the One Big Beautiful Bill over the next few years. One interesting point is that the change in the fertility assumption has very little effect in the near term. It's actually a little bit of a boost in the near term, very small, as we assume women are more likely to stay in the labor force if they don't have children. OASI by itself, just the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund, reserve depletion there is in the fourth quarter of 2032, as Rebecca mentioned at the outset. That is only one quarter earlier than in last year's report, but it does put us over that year threshold, moving us from 2033 to 2032. The DI reserves do remain positive throughout the 75-year long-range projection period, same as in last year's report. Next slide. Okay, this is the same information I was showing you before. This is the combined trust fund reserve depletion date. This is what we were projecting through time in various trustees reports. So you can see that in the last 15 or so years, those projections have been extremely stable. The date for the combined funds has been between 23 and 2035 for each one of those reports. Reminder, we're at 2034 right now. But then we've also graphed the year of the report on this graph, which shows you that we are getting ever closer to that year of reserve depletion. We are now only 8 years away from the year of combined reserve depletion, And if you look at OASI by itself, we are only 6 years away. Next slide. All right, I am not going to go through all of this in detail, but for those of you who are interested, you can peruse this at your leisure. Um, the other kind of big news story in this year's report, even though the reserve depletion dates changed very little, the longer term assumption or the longer term measures are significantly worse. We look at something called the actuarial balance, which is a summary measure over the next 75 years. This 4.42% of payroll you see right here, one way to think about that is if we increased payroll tax rates by that 4.42%, we would be solvent over the next 75 years. And we basically have 1 year of sort of a buffer at the end of the period. Last year's report, we were only at 3.82%. So you can see there was quite a big change in that measure. The biggest reason for the change, and we've got them all broken out here, was that change in the fertility assumption. That by itself was 0.35% of payroll. The immigration updates were 0.21% of payroll, and the one big beautiful bill, that legislation change, that was 0.16% of payroll. A couple things went in the other direction, the near-term economics that we talked about before, and also some changes in mortality data went in the other direction. Beyond that, there were a few minor things going in both directions, but overall, did get us to that significantly worse actuarial balance in this year's report. Next slide. This one is probably a familiar graph to those of you who have been in the game for a while. This is called the Social Security Trust Fund ratio, and it's the reserves as a percentage of the annual cost. Going through time from 1990 all the way through 2100, the blue line here shows you the DI trust fund. The red line shows you the OASI trust fund, and the black line is the combined trust funds. You can see that the red and the black lines, very little change from last year's report. That just reflects that the reserve depletion dates didn't move much for those. OASI, DI, excuse me, is actually in better shape this year than it was last year. So looking at DI by itself, you can see that blue solid line at the top shoots off into the stratosphere as we get out there. Those of you who are students of history will see in the blue line, we've got those two little bumps of tax rate reallocation. In the past, there were a couple of times where DI was getting very close to depleting its reserves. Congress made the choice to reallocate some of the rate from DI or from OASI to DI to put DI in a slightly better position. And since the last reallocation in 2016, DI has been in increasingly good shape. Next slide. Another familiar graph. This shows the annual cost and interest, non-interest income as a percent of taxable payroll. So the difference between those two lines as we get out into the projection period is really the size of the solvency gap. This is the gap we need to fill in order to make the trust fund solvent in the long run. The red line is income. The blue line is the cost of the program. You can see that those two crossed over each other in 2010. Since then, the cost of the program has been higher than the income of the program. And you'll also notice that in 2034, the solid cost line drops down to the level of income. And that's because when the trust funds run out of money, they're not able to pay those full scheduled benefits. We will have to drop down to pay out only what is coming in 2034. So the income and the cost beyond then are the same number. The dashed blue line is the benefits that are scheduled in the law. So the difference between those lines, again, is sort of the size of the problem we need to fix. If you look at the box at the bottom right in 2034, you can see that after the reserves deplete, about 83% of benefits will be payable. By the time we get out to 2100, that declines to about 65%. Next slide, please. All right, very quickly, this shows you the difference. This is the annual balance for last year's report and this year's report. The annual balance is just the difference between the income and the cost in each one of the years in the future. And the point of this graph is to show you that as we get far out into the projection period, financing is significantly worse this year than it was last year. And again, that's really the result of the fertility rate assumption change. The changes in immigration and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act do contribute, but the majority of this worsening in the annual balances is due to the fertility change. And it is really significant as we get out towards 2100. Next slide. All right, so when we're looking at solutions, how do we eliminate that long-term actuarial deficit? It is a simple math problem. It is not a simple political problem. We need to make choices addressing that shortfall between 2034 and 2100. We need to either raise scheduled revenue by 2034 by about 1/3, reduce scheduled benefits by about 1/4, or some combination of the two. Next slide. So bottom line, these long-term projections we do every year provide the information needed to assess solvency and the changes needed to eliminate the shortfalls. The trustees have consistently advised that Congress should act sooner rather than later. That sooner train has basically left the station at this point, but still, anything sooner is better than later. And if those trust fund reserves were to become depleted, full benefits could not be paid on time. Exactly how that would happen is still to be determined, and we could have a long discussion about that, but that would take many, many hours. So bottom line, Congress needs to act as they always have in the past. And there are straightforward solutions. You need to add revenue or you need to lower cost or both. Those changes need to be implemented by 2034, or if you're looking at OASI alone, really needs to be done by the end of 2032. Next slide. All right, those of you who would like more information about this or anything me and my team do, please take a peek at our website. You'll find the 2026 Trustees Report and all prior reports, and just a wealth of data information that we provide. So with that, let me turn it back to Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you so much for helping us both understand the big picture and also zoom in. I know we have a lot of folks who love to wonk out on the details too, and you had a little bit of everything there. And for anyone who's wondering, will this recording be shared? Because I'd love to go back and listen to some of that again or see those slides again. The answer is yes, and it will be posted on the Academy's website soon. So if you'd like to give this another listen, you will get a chance to do that. So as Karen's presentation makes clear, and I think she put it beautifully, there is actually a fairly simple math problem that needs to be solved here. But the American people understand that Social Security is more than a math problem to be solved. It's an incredibly important part of our nation's economic and social fabric. And so I'm really excited to turn to the portion of today's program where we're going to have an amazing panel of experts help to put those findings in context and start to dig into some of those policy options that Karen was alluding to that policymakers are going to need to start to evaluate with even greater seriousness and urgency than has happened in recent years, given the ticking clock. I'm going to go ahead and set up our panel and invite them to join us on the virtual stage while I introduce them. And I'm so delighted to be joined by such an outstanding panel of experts, all of whom are Academy members, many of whom are also Academy Senior Fellows. And so I'll try and do a very brief job of mentioning who each of them is, given that they all wear lots of hats, so we can get right into the conversation. Kathleen Romig leads Social Security and Disability Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where she's a senior fellow, one of the nation's leading experts on Social Security. Jason Fichtner is a senior fellow at the National Academy of Social Insurance. He's worn many hats over many years, but one of them is being Deputy Commissioner of the Social Security Administration. Catherine Ann Edwards is a labor economist, an author, a podcaster, and a senior fellow here at the Academy. And if you haven't seen her on TikTok, a little bit of a TikTok star these days who helps to break down these kinds of issues for broader and younger audiences. Teresa Gillarducci is professor of economics at the New School, where she is a nationally recognized expert on retirement security, and someone that we love working with here at the Academy. And last but not least, Joel Eskovitz is Senior Director of Social Security and Savings at AARP, and he leads policy work there and research on many issues, including Social Security, which is, of course, so important to AARP's members. Thank you all for being here with us. And I have to say, I'm particularly excited to get into this conversation with you all at a moment where it feels like Americans might disagree on everything except Social Security. This might be one of the few issues where people are actually remarkably united outside of Washington. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all, your key takeaways, and really what we want American policymakers to understand about what the American people want them to do with all of this information. So just to kind of kick things off at a high level, we've all had a chance to hear Karen walk through the findings. So what was your biggest takeaway from this year's Trustees Report is where we're going to start. And because we have such an amazing group, I'm going to ask each of you to keep your answers to about 2 minutes so we can cover as much ground as possible today. And I'm going to lead off with Kathleen.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for the presentation, Karen. That was wonderful. I guess what struck me, there's a gap. And so we have two ways of closing the gap. You either have less money going out or more money coming in, or of course you could do some kind of combination of those two things. And, understanding what I do and what anyone who benefits from Social Security does, is that the benefits are incredibly important. And so, and the program is incredibly beloved. So the contemplating the idea of reducing those benefits is really difficult. The politics are really difficult. It would cause a lot of difficulties for people who receive Social Security now and people who are planning to receive Social Security in the future. And so I think we really need to think hard about how to raise enough money so that we can afford those benefits going forward, since that is so much what people want. And I think some of the trends that have led to this gap over time, like rising inequality, is somewhere where we can kind of look to solutions to having people who are fortunate enough to have higher incomes and higher wealth contribute to that solution as well.
All of which I know we're going to have a chance to get into in more detail. Catherine, over to you next. What's your top takeaway this year?
I mean, the fertility numbers are pretty, not just surprising of how much of a change it was, not necessarily because it was divorced from reality, but I think just because of how much reality has changed in the United States, of how Americans really view and pursue having a family. In so many ways, I think Social Security is a mirror that shows back how our economy is doing. The depletion of the trust fund was accelerated by wage inequality. The depletion of the trust fund was accelerated by, economic mismanagement of the Great Recession that allowed for so little job growth for so long. I think these fertility numbers are showing a similar mirror, kind of looking back at us of what is going on in our economy that so few people are pursuing having children. And are we doing anything about it, I guess, is the question. I mean, so often when the trustees report comes out, we are, zeroed in on aspects of Social Security. But I think these types of assumptions really tell you to kind of like turn the view around and look back at the economy of just how hard it is to support a wage insurance program in the kind of economic situation that we have.
Yeah, and I know we'll have a chance to talk more about the fertility rates and to connect that to some policy options as well. You've been one of many people supporting a caregiver credit, for example, in Social Security. Lots of things that directly connect. Joel, what was your top takeaway?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for policy folks, this is maybe very basic, but I think for most of Americans, this is not, which is that Social Security will be continuing to pay out benefits into the next century. I think so many people see these numbers and think that the program will stop in the next 5 to 10 years. Obviously, the amount of benefits that it will be paying, and especially in that 75th year, that those numbers took a bit of a southward turn this year. But the program is still, very well funded just through incoming payroll taxes, and it just needs an extra kind of push from Congress in the next few years. But that this is still a very strong program that can be fixed, and as we'll talk about, I'm sure later, that most Americans want to be fixed by not cutting benefits.
Yeah, such an important point, right? It's just as important for us to understand what the numbers do say as what the numbers don't say, right? Given how much misinformation is often taken away from these headlines. Teresa, what was your top takeaway this year?
Again, it's if Congress does nothing, it's doing something. Doing nothing is a decision because without new revenue, Congress is letting Social Security cut itself. The law will automatically slash benefits across the board by 20 something. And I think the American people are actually starting to apprehend what that would mean for their own lives because it's the insolvency date is so close. Inaction, is a cut. And from my expert point of view, action should not be any benefit cuts. The rest of the American pension system is a big mess. The bottom 50% have nothing but Social Security and retirement, and they probably need a big boost in their Social Security benefits, so we need even more revenue. The next 40% have extremely fragile 401ks. A big portion of people in that middle and upper middle class actually really have nothing significant besides Social Security. And our researchers found that even among the top 10% of earners, a big portion of them have really nothing but Social Security. So we need action to raise revenue, and we just really can't lean on women to have more babies or to work until they're 70 or 75.
What an important takeaway, right? That actually inaction is action, and that even commitments not to touch Social Security right now are not actually enough, right? Because not touching is itself allowing a significant cut. Jason, what is your top takeaway before we start to dig into some of these themes?
So I want to do something a little bit different from what everyone else said because I agree with what everyone else said. So I'll add one more point, but I will take off from where Karen Glenn ended, which is for the last, 20 years or so, maybe more, Karen will tell me, the trustees have always said the sooner Congress acts, the better, and they encourage sooner action. But Karen said one thing, well, sooner is actually here now. We've been kicking the can down the road for so long, we're actually at the end of the road. So to give you an idea of how important this is, everyone here has talked about the idea and the importance of not reducing benefits. So if you want Social Security solvent and you don't touch the cost side, i.e. benefits, you have one option left basically, and that's revenues. So what Karen mentioned is the 2026 report talks about the actuarial balance now being about 4.42% as an actuarial deficit. So roughly speaking, you'd have to add 4.4 percentage points to the 12.4 you're paying now, or if you think about Medicare, 15.3, you're now getting very close to a 20% payroll tax with Medicare, half of the employer, half of the employee, to fund these programs. That's a huge burden on payroll taxes. Teresa mentioned revenue. She avoided saying payroll because we'll talk about how we might do some other ways to get revenue in it. So I think it's a very important conversation. But putting that much on payroll might really be harmful to labor productivity, labor hiring, especially as we're going towards artificial intelligence and other types of activities with the economy. And I want to point out why that road is now narrow. So Karen, I'm sure, still has nightmares when she worked with me on these reports. But I was the secretary of the Board of Trustees as deputy commissioner, and I signed 3 of these reports. The last one was actually 2010. So Karen, I pulled up 2010 for us to talk about today. The actuarial deficit today is 4.42. Back in 2010, it was 1.92, meaning it has more than doubled. So you think about the cost of inaction. Had we done something in 2010, that could have been a 1 percentage point payroll tax increase on employers, 1 percentage point on employees, would have put you at a 75-year solvency. Now we need 4.42, and if you wait till trust fund depletion, it gets to about 4.9. So that gap is now so narrow almost to be insignificant. The can can't be kicked very further down the road. We have to do something now. Otherwise, it's that basically full 5 percentage point increase.
So Jason, a perfect setup, because a lot of what you've teed up is, I think, a lot of folks who are part of this panel today have a lot of ideas and also a lot of takes on a lot of the leading ideas that are out there to look at what does it look like to bring revenues in? How should we be thinking about some of the benefit cuts that people talk about, like raising the retirement age? So let's go there. Let's get right into it. I feel like it's important to set the stage for that with just like a couple of minutes, reminding ourselves what Social Security means to people and what role it plays in people's lives, so that we have that kind of human grounding before we get into how we make the math work. And so Joel and Kathleen, I'm going to lean on the two of you to help us understand, with especially some of the recent polling that's happened, asking people what Social Security means to them. Joel, I'll lead off with you to help us understand what role Social Security plays in Americans' retirement security. And then Kathleen, would love to have you help us understand how it also shows up when it comes to disability and survivor benefits, which are also really important parts of this program.
Sure. So last year was the 90th anniversary of Social Security, and at ARP, we put out anniversary polls every 5 years, and I'm going to even take it back further than 2010 to 2005. And when we did an anniversary survey then, we had about half of Americans that substantially relied on Social Security for their retirement income. In last year's survey, that number moved up to almost 2/3. And we see this again in Academy polling around, how important Social Security is to your retirement income. We had something like 2% that said it was not important at all. So it is a really vital part of most Americans' retirement security and retirement income, despite the fact that perhaps at one time it was not envisioned as such. And you hear people talking about the three-legged stool and other forms of income. But for a lot of Americans, as Teresa said, this is it. This is what they have. And so we need to do our best to make sure that we're not reducing what people are barely getting by on.
And Kathleen, bringing you in there just because it's hugely important, even though retirement is often the piece that people focus most on in Social Security. Of course, it's a whole suite of insurance across the lifespan. It's there for us in case of disability. It's there as well in the form of survivor's insurance. Talk a little bit about those pieces and what Americans tell us those protections mean to them before we get right into policy.
Yeah, so exactly. Social Security is not just a retirement program. It is life insurance, it's disability insurance. And in fact, it's the only life and disability insurance program that most people participate in. But, most people don't have private life and disability insurance coverage. So that means when a parent dies and leaves minor children or an adult disabled child behind, then Social Security survivors benefits act as life insurance for their spouse and their children. If they're older, just for their spouse. And for disability insurance, if a worker has contributed to the system through the years and can no longer earn a substantial wage, then disability insurance is there for them. And I think it's really important to focus on the insurance part of social insurance. Social Security is an insurance program. It's not a retirement account. It's an insurance program that's designed to protect us against risks. The risks of retirement, meaning outliving your ability to earn a substantial wage, disability and death, but also the risk of inflation. the risk of a market downturn that could erode the value of your retirement account, the risk of job loss, the risk of outliving your savings, outliving your spouse. So we pool together our resources into this program to protect us against all kinds of different risks. And that's so important about Social Security. And that's one of the most important things that we need to make sure that we preserve, because we're living in a very volatile age now where we face even more risks than we did before. And we need to make sure that the program is responsive to those risks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Joel and Kathleen. I always think it's really important to start with the picture for people before we jump right into trying to solve the math problem, because sometimes Washington gets it backwards, right? So now taking us to some of the leading options, and Karen was beautifully kind of setting us up for this with, it's a straightforward set of options we have. We can raise revenues, we can cut benefits, or it can be some combination of the two. Let's dig into what some of those options are. And several of you in your opening takeaways were starting to make the case for why we need to be looking at revenues and why policymakers need to be looking at revenues. Teresa, I'd love to go to you first on this to help us understand some of what was underpinning some of where you started to go with why it's important for policymakers to be looking at that revenue side of the ledger. What's the case for a revenue solution?
One case was made actually about 20 years ago and beyond, and that is that we have carried a legacy debt in Social Security ever since it was founded. It was by design. The early generations got benefits without a lifetime of contributions. We did that on purpose. It lifted millions of elders out of poverty during the Depression. And those elders had been taking care of their own parents. So there was this legacy debt that we just took on as a society, and we all benefited. Right now, the whole society should help pay that debt off by broadening the base, not just payroll, as Jason will go back to that, talked about. To have it all on workers now doesn't really make sense. Broadening the base means, three things. We can lift the cap, we can tax investment income. And I'm going to focus on that right now. So that legacy debt is in the system now. We should pay that off. We should pay that off with legacy benefits. And much of the wealth that we see today is part of that legacy benefit. Investment income comes from inheritance. It comes from just a buildup of capital income. And so I published a Forbes blog today actually spelling this out. And one thought experiment I had is, say that all the legacy wealth now that we see in the tech market, and next week, the IPOs from the tech industry gave a gift to Social Security. It just transferred $20 to $30 trillion into a sovereign wealth fund that was directly credited to Social Security. We would solve the actuarial balance now. And that would illustrate the point. Legacy wealth should pay for legacy debt.
And I'm going to bring Kathleen in to help talk a little bit about revenues as well. I mean, Jason, you were setting some of this up by saying, if we did it all through across the board payroll tax increases, but a lot of people, as Teresa's mentioning, aren't looking at it that way. They're looking at other approaches to bringing in revenues and asking kind of what has changed about the economy over the last several decades, and how should we be thinking about those economic trends as we think about where should those revenues come from, and should it just be an across the board payroll tax increase, or should it be something else that maybe looks more at where the wealth is concentrated? Kathleen, help us understand a little bit about how you're thinking about the revenue side of the ledger and any of the themes that Teresa or Jason were offering.
Yeah, I think Karen laid out really well how over the long term, it's, our economics and demographics are just exactly what leads us to the position where we are now. Things change over time. The number of people that are born who come into this country And, that's the demographic side, how long people live. And then likewise on the economic side, how many people are working, how much are they earning, how much of those earnings are above the cap, like Teresa mentioned. And so those are all of the elements that contribute to, what is now a gap between what we've promised and what we can pay for. And so two of the most important demographic factor is the aging of the population. We just have an older population now than on average than we did before. And that means Social Security is more expensive than it was before. And so as a result, to support this larger older population, we just need more total revenues. And then as far as where those revenues are coming from, another thing that has really changed over time is inequality in what people are in their incomes, also even more so in their wealth. And as Teresa mentioned, it goes beyond wages, the paychecks that we earn. A lot of people, the richest people, they don't really make that much of their income based on their paychecks like the rest of us do. They are making their money off of their wealth. They have enormous investments. They're drawing those down in various things, or they're paying themselves through these elaborate arrangement pass-throughs and borrowing against investments and all these crazy things. And on that kind of income, you don't pay a penny on Social Security, not a cent. And so, those two things, the fact that their wages that we get have been increasingly unequal, much more so over the last 40 years than when last time policymakers dealt with Social Security, but even more so, the income that isn't taxed at all for Social Security has just become outrageously unequal. So I think, when we're thinking about how to get that bigger pot of money that we need to support the aging population, we need to think about, what those trends have been over the last few decades and how unequal things have gotten.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of folks who are going to want to get in more on this conversation, but to kind of keep us moving a little bit, and since we've got lots of questions flowing in, we're seeing your questions. They are making it to us. We will have time after this panel to get into lots of them, as many as we've got time for. I just appreciate you and Teresa both for breaking down what can get very wonky and complicated into some understandable ways to think about it, and to sort of ask the question, well, where are the American people on some of these ideas? Well, the Academy and AARP actually joined forces last year and asked some of these questions. Joel, do you want to maybe just pipe in quickly with how people feel about some of these revenue ideas, like lifting the payroll tax cap or going to other sources of wealth that people and income that people have, as Kathleen and Teresa have been talking about, because we did ask some of those questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what is surprising about the findings of the surveys that we did were that not only were people interested in going after money from the wealthy, which I think is something that, in almost any sphere, people are happy to tax rich people more, but people are willing to pay more themselves with a higher tax rate. And I just think that goes to show how important the program is to so many Americans. Those were the two top revenue fixes. There were other, areas where I think people were interested or even willing to say, government could borrow money for a time or tax other forms of income, such as capital gains. I think when we looked outside the system, investment, taxation on investment was the most popular of those alternative revenue approaches. But, again, it just goes back to this idea. If you have a binary decision here, I think the majority of Americans want the option that does not cut benefits. And so that, you've got to look then for more money to bring into the system.
And I said it before, but I'll say it again. It's one of the most maybe surprising things you ever find when you do these polls, right? It seems like Americans can't agree on anything right now, but when you ask about Social Security, you get like 85% plus agreement across Republicans and Democrats, people across income levels, education levels, generations, everybody saying what you just said. Don't cut the benefits, please bring in the revenues, do it primarily from people who have the most. But hey, if it means avoiding benefit cuts, we'd even be willing to chip in more. And that's sort of the TLDR that you hear from people, no matter what walk of life they come from. Jason, I want to go back to you to sort of ask you a brass tacks question, because you are great at boiling things down. Some people this week, in the wake of the Trustees Report release, have been kind of making the point that if someone says that they don't want to touch Social Security, if a policymaker is maybe opposed to or silent on bringing in revenues, some of these policy options that we've been hearing about from Kathleen and Teresa and now Joel, that they are de facto accepting benefit cuts, even if they say they don't want to touch Social Security. Is that a fair characterization?
Actually, I think it is, and it goes to show just how much today there's a fear of leadership in Congress. They are unwilling to stand forward. Not everyone, but the vast majority are unwilling to stand up and say we have to take action now, and there's no free lunch. If you don't want benefit cuts, you got to pay for it, and here's how much it's going to cost. If you want benefit cuts, here's how much it's going to be cut, and you got to be willing to live with that if you can afford to live with it. And too often we hear these political talking points. Hands off my Social Security and Medicare. Don't touch Social Security. I testified before Congress a few weeks ago, and that was one thing I heard is we promised not to touch Social Security. And I said, by agreeing not to touch Social Security, you are therefore de facto agreeing to a 20+% benefit cut, probably across the board. But as Karen says, that's TBD how that would be done. But you're basically saying we're going to let benefit cuts happen automatically because Social Security has no authority to raise revenue or borrow on its own. And I think what I'd like to hear is more honest politicians saying, no, we are going to touch Social Security, and here's how we're going to protect it for these beneficiaries. And be honest about it and start having that conversation. Because by saying we're not going to touch it means we can just leave this alone. There's nothing to see here. Just let's keep going on the glide path we are now. And that's not the right answer.
Yeah, it's hugely important to boil that down, especially now that Social Security is increasingly going to show up as an election issue, and people are going to be getting asked those questions, right? And I know we've got a lot of folks who are members of the media listening, and others who are going to be in a position to be asking those types of questions. So I want to segue into a next part of this conversation, which is we started to tee up what Americans want for the future of Social Security. What do they want from policymakers? And we've heard not to cut the benefits. We've heard people want the revenue brought into the system. But Americans don't stop there when you ask them what they want for the future of Social Security. You also, as we heard loud and clear from the polling the Academy did with AARP, you hear that people actually want to see the program strengthened and in certain key ways. And Catherine, I'd love to go to you first on this because you mentioned the fertility rates piece, which is one of those kind of big takeaways a lot of people have from the Trustees Report this year in terms of a shift. But you took it to a broader place, which is what's going on in real people's lives that might be making them choose not to have kids. And that's a conversation a lot of folks are having in Washington. I'd love for you to help us understand the momentum behind a policy that's getting a lot more attention in the context of Social Security these days that very much relates. And that's the idea of creating what some people have called a caregiver credit. Talk a little bit about that, and then, connect that to some of those broader themes that you were bringing up about what's going on in real people's and families' lives.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the cost of waiting and how Congress, not intervening, not touching it has its own price in terms of Social Security's long-term finances. There is also a cost to atrophy on every other aspect of every economic policy. Right, there is a cost to waiting on having a paid family and medical leave program in the United States. There's a cost to waiting on raising the federal minimum wage above $7.25 an hour. When you produce an economy that's is falling under the governance of not pursuing higher earnings, not pursuing higher labor force participation, not pursuing investments in children's and families, Social Security bears the cost of it. And so it's not just congressional inaction on Social Security that takes a toll, it's congressional inaction in so many other aspects of economic policy that also takes a toll on Social Security. And where you can really see that kind of come together is something like childbirth. When you have a kid, you probably pay some type of, insurance task for out-of-pocket costs for labor and delivery. It acts like a tax on childbirth in the U.S. that you have to pay somewhere between $3 to $5 grand out of pocket when you go in for labor and delivery. It is very unlikely that you have significant paid family leave for both people who are the parents, especially if if they're adoptive couple. And then that gets added into a system of very expensive childcare. So we have made having a child in the U.S. into a luxury good, because we make every aspect of it, especially in the early years of life, very expensive. Now, I agree with Teresa. Social Security shouldn't rest on like, hey, women, have more kids to prop up a social insurance program. Like, that's the answer we're looking for. I think the answer we're looking for is there a way that our economy is underperforming that Social Security is hurting because of? And how we treat children and families in the US is a pitch perfect example. I think it's one that's not brought up as much as, say, the inequality in wealth. And then you kind of see wealth inequality and earnings inequality lead to this, well, we should tap investment income for Social Security. I think what we need to have a kind of as strong conversation about is the lack of investment in children and families also needs to be addressed and thought of in the context of Social Security. A policy where this comes together, not just a federal social insurance paid family medical leave program that would add that benefit in, but a caregiver credit for workers who are not working for paid labor, but working inside their household, taking care of someone, to make that recognized in Social Security's program and benefit design, so that this invisible labor, this labor that is not remunerative for some private company, but is beneficial to the economy, is acknowledged in this program. We've talked, everybody here has some kind of affiliation with the National Academy of Social Insurance, but I think the North Star to these conversations has to be, what is the risk? And has the risk changed? For a lot of Americans, the risk has changed. So the program that ensures it needs to change too.
Oh, it's such a great way to put it, Catherine, and it really it brings forth, right, the some of the famous words from FDR in signing the Social Security Act as part of the New Deal, right? The hazards and vicissitudes of life, right? That's what this is all about. Pooling our resources, right, to protect ourselves from these different risks that we know are part of life. That takes me to a question, Teresa, I really would love to throw to you, because risk is very much part of this topic. Something that's been getting a lot of attention lately is an idea for creating savings plans for people who don't have employer-provided savings plans. The president actually recently talked about this, and we've seen a lot of interest around this idea. But we've also seen some people saying, well, maybe that could be a substitute for Social Security. So how do we think about this idea of Trump savings plans, or whatever they might be called, and how does that fit into this conversation about Social Security and retirement security?
Quickly, back in 1983, we had high hopes that when Congress cut Social Security benefits by raising the retirement age, that the private retirement system would fill it in. The 401ks would expand and everybody would have a layer of pension on top of their Social Security. So back in 1983, it was always views that the great American pension system would be Social Security as a base, and the employer pension system would fill in. 40 years later, that hope is now dashed. That experiment of a do-it-yourself employer plan did not work, and 63 million workers are left out of that layer on top of Social Security. So the Trump IRA plan brings forward the complaints from all sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. We've got to give something to the 60 million people that don't have anything. And so the Trump IRA account is a way to bring in a layer of wealth on top of Social Security. But maybe some people are talking about substituting those retirement accounts for Social Security. But in my conversations with the Trump administration, no one there inside the administration is talking about making this a substitute. The math just doesn't work out. We need a diverse sources of income for retirement. Adding an advanced funded layer is a smart, diverse portfolio move, but it has to be done on the base of Social Security. So Social Security can never be substituted by these private accounts. And other countries that do it well don't substitute private accounts for their pay-as-you-go system.
And I just want to add here, because this is really important, because Teresa made a very good point about this. So the traditional IRAs and employer contributions to employer plans have actually worked out really well across the board, but not necessarily the same for everybody. So they have created a lot of people have access to the markets, to wealth generation that they never had before, even under defined benefit pension plans. So it's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, make it better. And Social Security is designed on average to replace about 40% of someone's income for the average American. It's not designed to replace 100% for everybody. It's part of that three-legged stool. So Teresa's point, which is very valid, is you need to have Social Security as that foundational leg, but then access to private markets, access to an employer plan, Trump accounts start filling in that gap for those who don't have access to an employer, it's very important. And the key to making it work is to make sure it has access to the savers credit for people who have lower incomes and have some sort of seed money so that it can grow and be something that complements Social Security, not replaces it.
So because I know everybody on this panel would love to get in on this, I'm going to commit here in public that we're going to have a follow-up conversation entirely dedicated to talking about the idea for these Trump savings plans, how they should fit into the larger retirement security conversation, because I am unfairly going to move us on. So you've heard me say it now loud and clear. We're going to do another conversation on that. But Joel, speaking of people who are maybe not doing as well with that three-legged stool, and people who maybe are not actually as well served by Social Security as some others, raising the retirement age is a conversation that continues to happen. People continue to propose that, even though not everyone is living longer. And yet on the flip side, there's actually an idea gaining more attention and more momentum that we've seen also do really well in polling that we've done with you guys when it comes to actually asking the American people, what do they want to do about folks who might not be living longer? Talk a little bit about raising the retirement age, how people feel about it, and what people might want to do instead.
Yeah, so I mean, it was interesting to note, looking into the actuary's report, the trustees report, life expectancy at 65 continues to go up until 2100, but that's the average, and that is not born equally. There is inequality there as well in longevity, and so folks who are wealthier, folks who have higher education, tend to live longer. What has happened then to the rest of the folks who are not living as long, we've now seen about a 40+ year build toward this higher retirement age. Now just about everyone has a 67 retirement age. But for people that can't make it to 67, you can claim as early as 62. And the difference between claiming early now versus when the retirement age was 65 is a pretty a big penalty. You get a reduction between 6 and 8% for every early year that you claim before your full retirement age. And so I think we have seen in our survey work, raising the retirement age is not very popular. I think people are beginning to understand it is a cut. You're waiting an extra year to get the exact same benefit. But also recognizing that not everyone can wait that long. And one of the areas that we tested was around what we're calling a bridge benefit, although I know Teresa also has a bridge benefit. So we'll have to have, I don't know, we'll have to have some sort of contest to see who wins the rights to that. But whatever you call it, it is this idea that that penalty for early claimers should be reduced for folks that are doing physically challenging work. I do a job that I can do into my 80s, I'm sure. I'm sitting in front of a desk. But that's not, every American. And for people that are limping to 62, this doing something to make the early claiming penalty a bit less, less of a penalty would be really, really helpful. And we did see that picked up by a lot of our survey takers as something that they were interested in. And I also want to remind folks, raising the retirement age really doesn't do anything in this short-term conversation. It is a fix for a long-term problem, but not really clear that that's a great fix. And it is kind of a red herring in the current debate, because as you saw, the 1983 reforms and the 40+ years of raising that age, it is not something that Congress wants to do, like that. They're gonna push that one way off into the future. So it doesn't really even do a whole lot in the context of this debate.
So one other group of people who are part of the Social Security system, but who often get forgotten, which I want to give us a minute to talk about, and Jason and Kathleen in particular would love to give both of you a chance to talk about, that's folks who receive supplemental security income, SSI, which is sort of the often forgotten piece of that larger Social Security system. It's a really important component of the system to protect people who aren't going to otherwise be fully protected by Social Security for one reason or another. another. Jason, you recently wrote an op-ed with Andrew Biggs talking about how SSI should fit into a larger conversation about Social Security, and particularly as we think about folks who are most at risk of experiencing poverty in old age. How should we be thinking about SSI as part of that Social Security solvency conversation? And Kathleen, I'll let you say a few things about this if you want to, too, and to correct anything Jason gets wrong.
Well, since you, me, and Kathleen have written an op-ed on this together, hopefully we're all on the same page. But I think it's important to consider SSI when thinking about Social Security reform in the greater context of retirement security reform, because SSI is basically an anti-poverty program, but it hasn't been refreshed in 40 years. There's still asset limits and income limits that are way out of date that haven't been updated for inflation, again, like 40 years. Those things need to happen regardless of what we do with Social Security. But it's important to think about SSI in the context of retirement security in general, because you want people to be able to save for retirement and be able to work and save for retirement. And so for those who are able or can work, you don't want to have barriers to keep them and prevent them from doing so. So we need to think about SSI as part of the conversation with Social Security, disability as part of the conversation, HI, the Medicare program, probably Medicaid as well. Long-term care needs to be part of the conversation. We need to think holistically, because we're probably going to have only one bite at this apple. It's sort of like as a tax economist, you get to do tax reform once every generation, once every 30, 40 years. The last major reforms for Social Security were 83. We're at that generational reform, so let's try to think holistically of how we want our retirement package to look like, our healthcare package. Catherine also mentioned the idea of caregiver credits. Let's start thinking about what we want to see. I'm not saying we're going to get it all, but it should all be part of the conversation holistically as we move forward with reform options.
Yeah, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention paid leave as well, given that that was one of the parts of the New Deal that fell out, right? And is totally related to some of what Catherine mentioned. If we're doing Jason's holistic plan, which I'd love to call the Fichtner plan from now on, and cite you for naming all those different elements of what needs to
All
be
that means is everything on the table, not you get everything.
Kathleen, anything you want to add about how to think about how SSI fits into Social Security as we think about poverty and old age?
Yeah, I think Jason said it so well that the two programs are really integrated. It's supplemental security income. It was designed as a supplement to Social Security for people who receive low benefits or no benefits out of the program. And so if you think about like elderly poverty, for example, you could raise Social Security benefits to $1 million and you'd still have a elderly poverty because there are some people who are not reached by Social Security. So you really, SSI is such an important piece of the puzzle. And as Jason said, when we think about like, we're encouraging people to save for retirement. If the SSI program prohibits them from doing so, then they're simply not allowed to be prepared for retirement. And that's the truth about SSI, is that we only allow people to save up to $2,000 across their checking account, savings account, 401k, IRA, emergency fund, you name it, $2,000 total. So of course, people aren't going into retirement ready. And then finally, they can only, if you get both Social Security, you did earn a Social Security benefit and an SSI benefit, you can keep $20 of your earned Social Security benefit. And after that, it's dollar for dollar reduced if you get SSI. So there's not, these programs aren't working well together. They were designed to complement each other, but they're not working well together. They're undermining one another. And so we need to think about that, like Jason said, holistically, when we, open kind of Pandora's box on Social Security.
So Teresa, I'm going to throw you one more question, and then we are going to open it up to audience Q&A, because we got a lot of good questions in here, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can in a little bit of a lightning round. But Teresa, you held a conference actually just a couple of months ago up at the New School that was all about reimagining the economics of later life. And I'd love to give you a moment to just speak to one of the core ideas you've really been hammering home within the economics profession, and increasingly, I think, a message you've been carrying into Washington circles, which is that we got to move beyond this idea that economic productivity is what determines a human being's worth. So talk a little bit about how that shift in perspective could shape how we think about retirement security and aging, especially in a moment where we hear a lot about a so-called gerontocracy.
Yes, we notice that economists are very good at talking about how investments in children redounds back to the economy because of their productivity is increasing. But that space and framework leaves out investing in older people. And so I push back hard on the idea that productivity determines a human worth. If we accept that frame, we end up saying older people deserve support only if they work, whether they work for pay or without pay or are physically broken down by work. Think about that as a justification for retirement. Of course, older people do valuable work, and of course, some have disability that prevent them from working. But what if our idea of a good society is people catching a break, wanting to loaf and control the pace and content of your time is not a moral failure. And when workers have a chance to define what they want to do with their productivity, they fight for good jobs and paid leave. And retirement is just another version of paid time off. You know, back in the 30s, when Social Security was created, John Maynard Keynes wrote that society would grow so rich that we'd only need to work 4 hours a day. And the economic possibilities for a rich society is a richly deserved time to control the pace and content of your own time. And we are rich, and we need a healthier Social Security system and retirement system.
So we've got lots of questions, and we're going to get into it, and we're going to get to as many as we can. So let's segue into, guys, you ready for this? A lightning round. We're going to keep even shorter answers. We gave you generous, luxurious 2-minute answers, but now we're going to move them to 1-minute answers. Okay, and let's bring Karen back with us on the panel here, because we are probably going to have some questions for her too. So question number 1 comes from one of the interns who actually came to the Academy's Demystifying Summer Social Insurance seminar earlier this morning, where they got a preview of the Trustees Report. And that question, I think, Catherine Edwards, I'm going to take to you. I think you'll be best for this one. People often say that Social Security is an issue for older Americans, but why should a 20 or a 25 or a 30-year-old care about this debate?
Well, I think you could take a couple approaches to why you should care about Social Security. The first one is that it is your insurance, and you'd never be able to buy such a good policy on the private market. As Kathleen and others have said, I mean, it's life insurance, it's disability insurance, it's, you know, the guarantee of inflation protected annuity to keep you from being poor in old age, and you couldn't buy this benefit if you tried. But, you know, the other way to think about it would be to say, you know, you're going to retire in 45 to 50 years. Nobody plans on being poor. Nobody's like, well, I'm going to be the person that's completely dependent on Social Security because I'm not going to try between now and then. You know, so much happens over the course of 50 years that you can't predict. Over 50 years, you should expect to live through at least 2 major industrial shifts in the United States. You should be able to live through probably 4 to 5 recessions, if not 6. And you can no way predict how all of that will affect you. You can just insure against it. I mean, you buy a house one day, you don't have savings in case a tree falls on it, you buy insurance. This is your insurance through your economic life. A lot of people will say because they're young that they could invest more and be smarter and don't need it. I'm sure everybody thinks that, but life can prove to be a lot more challenging. So why would you walk away from the protection against the risk that you face as opposed to spurning insurance and saying you're always going to be smarter than it? Nobody's smarter than risk. It hits all of us.
And as a lightning round answer, they need to care because they're the ones who are going to be paying for it. They're going to bear the burden, the majority of the burden of any tax increase or benefit changes. So they need to care about it today.
They do need to care about it today. And then, of course, if you want a lot of really poor old people and cut off benefits, like, you know, if the government stops paying for old people's economic security, I promise you, you will. Right? It's not as if they're suddenly going to come up with an infinite amount of resources on their own. They will look to their family. So you're either paying through this with payroll taxes, or you're having a lot of individually kind of burden of taking care of older generations, which is what happened before Social Security.
So I'm going to move us along. We have a question from Amy at CBS News. Amy asks, I've been hearing more and more about means testing Social Security. In fact, it got mentioned yesterday at a hearing with the Social Security Commissioner. How would that work? What would it mean for beneficiaries? And what an important issue to bring in, given that there are a lot of ideas floating that would be cuts to benefits, but along the lines of quote unquote means testing. Kathleen, do you want to lead off with that one?
Sure. So last time we had a big Social Security reform in 1983, there was a form of means testing introduced, which is called taxation of benefits. And so it's what that did was say, if you're a senior who's receiving your Social Security benefits and you have an income that is on the relatively high side, then we're going to kind of claw back part of your Social Security benefits in the form of taxes. And those taxes are contributed back into the trust fund. Okay. Well, guess what just happened to those taxes and the one big, beautiful bill? We cut them. And you know what? Guess what else? There's bipartisan support for maybe even eliminating them. There's a lot of talk these days about no tax on Social Security. So, as much as people like to talk about stuff like means testing, they really don't like it in reality. And so, we're actually moving in the opposite direction politically on both sides of the aisle. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, but it's one that I just don't know if it's how well it's going to stand up in the face of the politics.
I'm going to keep us moving because there's a lot that could be said there. We've got a question for you, Karen, coming from Nancy Altman, and that is about one of the assumptions baked into this year's Trustees Report. So she's asking about the assumptions about income inequality. Are you expecting covered earnings as a percentage of total earnings to increase, be stable, or decrease? Did that make sense?
It did. I knew I could count on Nancy for a technical question like that. We are expecting this is basically about the percent of earnings that falls above the cap. We are expecting that to remain relatively level going forward. So no real changes in the future. Arguments could be made for it going down, going up. We feel like the best course is to keep it level.
Super helpful, Karen. Thank you for that question, Nancy. And it was referenced before, but just for those paying attention and taking notes at home, when you do look retrospectively, inequality has had a huge impact on the Social Security trust funds, which is what makes that question so important. And some of the analysis from our friends at the Economic Policy Institute suggests about $1.4 trillion lost to the Social Security trust funds over the past 4 decades as more and more wages at the very top have escaped the payroll tax, which is capped at 90% of covered wages. We got a little wonky. We're going to zoom back out. Okay. So we've got a question that very much relates to that. Oh, good segue from Joanne Fritsch. Since there is an anachronistic cap on the amount of Social Security payroll tax paid by high earners, wouldn't it be reasonable for Congress to remove that cap on Social Security taxes paid by high earners? Joel, let me throw that to you.
Well, without getting into, I mean, that is certainly one very viable option. I think as part of that conversation, you do need to think about, well, what do you do with those increased contributions? So it's not just a simple question of just asking them for more contributions. You do have to think about whether you're also going to give them additional benefits. But there are a lot of different ways. And, going back to the survey that we looked at, folks wanted to keep the cap and then impose a new tax above 400,000. That's one way to do it. There are a host of different ways to do it, but yeah, it has not really captured, nearly as much of the wage income as it used to, and so that cap certainly it's always the most popular reform option out there, and with good reason, because I think a lot of people don't understand why it's there and are surprised to learn about it if they themselves are not subject to it.
Yep. People get really surprised when you try to explain the issue. As somebody who's a teacher or a nurse or a construction worker, pays Social Security taxes all year long. Somebody who is, making $1 million only pays those for just a portion of the year. People look at you and go, what? Why did we do that? That doesn't make sense. So a question from Emily Peck. 2 questions from Emily Peck at Axios. So question 1 is about immigration and fertility assumptions. And so Karen, part of this is coming your way, and Kathleen, part of this is coming your way. So Karen, what is the interplay between the fertility assumptions and the immigration assumptions? She says, my understanding is that a decline in immigration would lead also to a decline in fertility.
Yeah, great question. There is a lot of interplay between those assumptions. Emily is right that traditionally immigrant women have had higher birth rates. So if we have fewer women who are immigrants, the overall birth rate would go down. Now, that said, there's also the interplay of, people coming into the country immediately become workers. So they are sort of a substitute for births that may or may not have happened about 20 years ago. So those two assumptions are interrelated in many, many ways.
And Kathleen, the immigration follow-up, I think, is for you, and that is, how important is immigration to Social Security's long-term finances, and has there been any effect that we should understand in the last year or so in terms of shifting immigration policies?
Yeah, it's super important because this is a program where we want, to maximize the number of workers paying in compared to the number of workers receiving benefits. That's what puts us on good financial footing. And like Karen said, you can get those more workers through babies, although it does take a little while for those babies to grow up and become workers, or you can get them through immigration. And if you get more workers through immigration, that's something you can really influence through policy. You can't necessarily, a lot of countries have tried to improve birth rates through policy. It's really, really hard. You can pretty easily turn the dial on immigration, though. There's all kinds of people who want to immigrate to this country. But right now, especially over the past year, we are not letting them in. In fact, we're kicking them out. And so we have had net negative immigration by many estimates this past year. And this administration is significantly limiting immigration into the country. In fact, lawful immigration has decreased even more than undocumented immigrants. And so that is having a big effect on the Social Security finances. Like Karen said, like it's one of the big drivers of the deterioration that we saw over the last year. And that's assuming that the Trump very restrictive immigration policies are quickly reversed, that we experience those much, much, much lower levels of net immigration for just a few years, and then we revert to a somewhat lower level of immigration than we had before, but pretty close to the historical norm. And so, only if we quickly reverse this very, very draconian immigration policy that we have now, are we even going to be so lucky as to have the, somewhat difficult gap that we face in Social Security now. Otherwise, if we sustain these policies, it's going to look a lot worse.
A question for you, Teresa, about your hypothetical about a big transfer to Social Security, which is an interesting, maybe new idea for some people. And the question is, the 20 to 30 trillion you suggested that should be transferred to Social Security is a huge number. It's close to US GDP, and you were suggesting that's the number that should come from the AI companies. Can you explain where you're getting that number? And do you have any basis for the number?
No, in the same place where Elon Musk gets a number for SpaceX. It was really just illustrating the point that there's a lot of investment income that can be taxed. And there are 3 proposals in Congress right now that raises the cap and taxes investment income. The same kind of fantasy thought I had about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And those proposals are from Senator Whitehouse, Representative Boyle, Representative Larson, who's carried this. He's taken up the responsibility of Congress needed to do something, 20 years ago, and also from Senator Sanders. And the point is that we broaden the base by taxing investment income. The justification are to pay off that legacy debt. Also, justification just comes from the American society and from the Social Security Administration itself. Back in the 1930s and 40s, we expected Social Security to be funded by general revenues. It was in the advisory report. In my blog today, I talk about the Murray Amendment in 1948 that Republicans and Democrats passed that said if the payroll tax falls short, and it is, then general revenues will make up the rest of the shortfall. And if we had not repealed that in 1950, we would not be here today, Rebecca, and we would be talking about something else. So taxing investment income is a sound idea, and the time has come.
Can I just add to that real quick, Rebecca? Because the $30 trillion number was, I think, it's getting people that's a big number. It's the size of the economy. So Karen didn't mention it, but she can obviously opine on this. The shortfall between the revenues coming into the program and the cost of the program on a net present value basis is now $29.3 trillion.
Yes.
So
That's where I got the number. That's
Yeah.
where I got the number.
And that is
Yeah.
a huge number. Don't get me wrong. It's
Right.
you know, almost the size of our national debt, size of the economy. It's a big number. So
Thank you, Jason. Mingli from Urban has a wonderfully easy to answer question, so I'll get that out of the way. She says, this is really helpful. Will there be anywhere to download the slides? Answer, yes, we will have a recording posted with the slides. You will see that soon. And we've got Mark Goldwine, unhappy with something that you said, Joel, so I'm going to give you a chance to put it in context. He said, how could you say that the long-term financing gap is a red herring to deal with? I think you were talking about the retirement age increase being a red herring because of how little as a percentage of the long-term financing gap it would actually contribute, but just wanted to allow you a chance to put that in context.
Yes, yeah, I was indeed. Yes, no, I think the financing gap is real and certainly something that we have to address. But I think trying to fix the problem and that so many people think this idea of, well, we'll just raise the age and that'll solve everything. It really doesn't, and it certainly doesn't in the short term. That was the point I was getting at.
Thank you so much for that, Joel. Tara Siegel-Bernard from The Times. Hi, Tara. Follow-up question to Emily's question, also for Karen. Karen, the trustees report assumes more optimistic fertility assumptions than the Congressional Budget Office and others. Is that because OACT is assuming a return to more normalized immigration, fertility, or both? Can you elaborate on why OACT's fertility assumptions differ from CBO's? We promised you some walks.
All right.
You're getting really smart questions here.
Great. All right. Well, a couple things before I get into the meat of the question. Number one, we have rebranded ourselves as Actuarial Services. So we are no longer Office of the Chief Actuary. Number two, all of these assumptions are really trustees' assumptions. They are not our office's assumptions. We do recommend and work with the trustees on these assumptions, but they are the trustees' assumptions. That said, yes, our fertility assumption is a little bit more optimistic than CBO's. We tend to take a very long-term approach when we're looking at these assumptions. So we are looking 75 years in the future. We don't want to react too quickly to trends that are going on now and assume those will go on forever. So yes, in effect, we're assuming there will be a rebound back up to that 1.75 level in the longer term. It is an assumption we look at every year. So there is the possibility for changes as we go forward, but this is where we are right now.
One more question from Karen Andres, and then I'm going to give you guys all 10 seconds to wrap us up with a little lightning round. We're going to get even faster with our closing answers. Karen Andres from Aspen says, it's clear to anyone who understands American household finances that households need both Social Security and private savings. Do the panelists have any ideas for how we can advocate for both at the same time without pitting one against the other? Teresa, you want to lead off with that?
Yeah, just keep on saying what the American workers want. They want both. They want a diverse sources of income for their retirement. And it's very popular. It's just not that hard.
And I think that'll take us to our closing lightning round. And I apologize to anyone whose questions we didn't get to. We got to almost all of them, but please feel free to let us know if we didn't get to your question and you want us to take it to the panel, and we can try and get you some follow-ups. But I'd love to close out by giving our panelists, and Karen, I'm going to take you off the hook for this and say you don't need to be the one to answer this question, but I'd love to give our panelists a chance in just a sentence to answer the question, what questions should our leaders be asked in the next several years, now that Social Security is increasingly being looked to as an election issue? What questions should we be asking our leaders in the coming years, especially with so many members of the media and other experts listening in? Kathleen, I'll give you the first shot.
Sure. With so many leaders across the political spectrum, including President Trump promising not to cut benefits, how are you going to pay for it?
Joel, I'll go to you next.
Was mine. Yeah, I think, someone also mentioned it earlier, no action is action. And, what are you going to be proactively doing in the next 6 to 10 years to solve this problem?
Jason, over to you.
I would say, what is your Social Security solvency plan? And also, what is your retirement security plan? So we get back to thinking holistically. And we didn't talk about debt financing, but we can't borrow our way out of this. When we get to trust fund depletion, the gap we're talking about is at $600 billion in 2035. So over a 5-year period, that's $3 trillion additional borrowing. I'm not sure the market will let us do that. So again, what is your Social Security solvency plan and what is your retirement solvency plan?
Important to squeeze that in as well, that note on borrowing. Teresa, what questions should we be making sure our leaders are being asked?
Mine's leading. Don't you think we should broaden the base by raising the cap and investing in investment income to bring more Social Security revenue into Social Security?
And Catherine, you're going to get the last word.
Americans want Social Security in the future. How are you going to give it to them?
I can't think of a better way to wrap up, and especially by putting this to what the American people want and grounding everything in that question, as I would challenge all of us who work on these issues in Washington to do. And with that, thank you to everyone for joining us today. This was just such an informative panel, such an informative conversation, and just a huge extra thanks to Karen Glenn for taking time in such a busy week to join the Academy to offer the facts and figures on what this Trustees Report found. As I noted, this recording will be posted on the Academy's website very soon, along with slides, so you can come back and check it back out again. And just thanks everyone for joining us today. And we will send you off with good energy and lots of gratitude for everything everyone in this community does to work on these issues. Thanks, everyone.